Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we're going to look at one of the most audacious moves in chess, and this is one of the moves that shows why chess is such an incredibly interesting game. So e4, e5, very natural move by white, attacking the king's pawn, very natural move by black, defending it. White targets the f7 square with the bishop comes to a good square. Now, here, black can play a move like bishop c5, which is a good move. It develops the bishop, but also black can, and this is astonishing that black can get away with this, play knight f6. So knight f6 allows white to pull off the trick that he was threatening to pull off. Because by playing knight f6, you allow white's knight to move to g5. Before you move the knight, the queen was covering the g5 square, so white couldn't move it there. And also, even if the knight did get to g5, the black knight could go to h6, defending the f7 square. So what black does is, you always say that good moves in chess are moves that achieve two things. And this is a move that actually achieves two things for white, rather than achieving two things for black. So it allows white to play knight g5, and it's really not obvious how black defends the f7 square, and that's a fork. So Keith Foreman asked me to do some videos on gambits. So strictly speaking, we'll find this is a gambit. Black is here playing a gambit. So the main line here for black is to play pawn d5, which blocks the bishop from f7, so stops white from taking. The natural move for white is to take it, and I would say the natural move for black, the most sort of obvious move that cries out in the position, is for black just to take back, because that's pawn's attack twice, right? You can just take back. And all of a sudden, black has control of the centre, black has nice development, white's pieces look slightly misplaced, that knight has moved twice, the knight's attacked. Unfortunately for black, white has an extremely good move here. So in the old days, taking on d5 with the knight used to be thought of as a blunder. These days, some top players occasionally play this, and white is sacrificing a piece. Black takes. White has a brilliant move here, check, which attacks the knight. Black has to defend it with the king. White can then play knight c3, but it's not immediately winning the knight, because black has various moves. So one of them is this, which defends the knight and threatens a fork on c2. And as it might be, the game goes on. It's complicated. The engines say that white's a bit better here, but facing this across the board as white, if you haven't really analysed it, isn't that easy. And right now, my Stockfish is saying, well, Stockfish is changing its mind, but it's saying, well, it's plus 0.5. But, you know, in a practical game, in such a sharp position, I mean, white's given up a piece. But, I mean, I suppose what I say is, I wouldn't recommend playing this as black, unless you like to have fun, and maybe we all like to have fun. But the sort of standard move, and the move that Stockfish likes at depth 821, is knight a5. This is the usual move. Then you get a check here with the bishop. The pawn blocks, takes. The bishop runs to either e2 or d3. There's also, so the bishop runs to e2 or d3. There's also a kind of interesting move where you get queen f3, which then pins the c6 pawn, so it can't take the bishop because the rook falls. But basically, this is a sharp line. I'm going to show, actually, just the line where the bishop goes to e2, because I think it's quite... It gives a sort of feeling for the opening, a flavour. You push the knight back, so all of a sudden white's pieces are in retreat. Pawn e4, you get knight e5. Oh, that's wrong. Knight e5, not d4. You get knight e5. Then black can develop the bishop, perhaps to d6. And essentially, black has a lot of activity and a lot of attack. Maybe c5 is nicer, eh? What do you think? I think c5. We always used to play c5, didn't we? I think c5 is nice. Anyway, you get an equal position. Black has a lot of activity, a lot of space. White's knight looks a bit precarious, doesn't it, on e5? Um, I mean, for instance, I know it's not Black's move, but Queen d4 on the next move would be terminal for White, so White needs to do something about it. So White plays c3. You know, it's an interesting. Come on, let's look at a few more lines. Well, castle castle is castle castle queen c7, d4, taking en passant. The knight takes. You know, Black's got open play, and has certainly, according to the engine, has more than compensation. It has the better game in this position, according to the engine. So the point is that d5 is a pretty good move. Now, White can equalise. Let's have a look at White equalising with best play. White, I think these days, I know Wesley So in his chessable course is recommending bishop d3 here, which leads to a slightly different kind of game. White can equalise, but it's the sort of position that gambit players might like to play. Players like Keith, you know, it's a very interesting position. There's also some really flashy stuff that Black can do, and this is absolutely fascinating. Black can play pawn b5 here, right? And so this looks really crazy because the knight's still attacked, the pawn is free, but the point is, if the bishop takes the pawn, the queen can then take on d5, hitting the bishop, defending the knight, and Black's absolutely fine in these lines. If White takes here, then Black takes there, and again, Black's absolutely fine. And actually, what the best move for White here is the incredible bishop f1. Then I think the main line is you take with the knight. No, I don't like that one so much. There's a really fun one. Isn't a really fun one this? The really fun one is you go knight d4. This is fascinating. Defending the pawn on b5, really sharp, right? Pawn c3. Then you take here with the knight, attacking the knight on g5 with the queen. White takes here. Black picks up the knight. Bishop's taking here with check. King runs to d8. White short castles. And then, okay, the software's hung. Bishop b7. This is all quite typical. Queen f3, which looks scary because you're putting it right in the way of a discovered attack. And even more scary, now Black's played rook b8 because the bishop's defended, and so the discovered attack becomes more real. White calmly takes the pawn on e5. Black then has this, what looks like an absolutely fantastic move, knight e3, which is attacking the queen with the bishop and also threatening, well, trying to threaten a checkmate on g2 because the knight, the bishop and the queen are all hitting g2, and clearly if the queen hits that, defended by the knight or the bishop, that's mate. Unfortunately for Black, White has an even better move, queen h3, which continues to defend g2 but also threatens checkmate on d7. So Black's best is to take here, swap, take with the knight, and then kind of after d4 the game goes on. And White's a bit better in this position. Black's developing a bishop. White's a bit better, but it's a fascinating line, and I suppose it's an interesting one to plunge into. It's a beautiful one, and maybe if Black players think the White player doesn't know exactly what he's doing, then it's quite a good one to try. So that's all possible by Black in this line, but Black has an even more ambitious or complex alternative, which is almost unbelievable that this is playable, which is bishop c5, the famous Trexler counterattack or Wilkes-Barre variation. So Black really does allow the fork on f7. So you allow the fork, then Black's taking here with check. Now, the old suggestion is you play king f1, because if you take on f2, then there's a check here, and black gets a really big attack, which the engine shows can force a draw. I mean, let's just look at it since we're here. So king g1, queen here, white tends to play g3, the knight takes. Let's just take it back and see what happens. King f1, and then I think it says rook f8 draws, although I always like to castle. Can you castle? You cannot really castle, because then apparently there's queen h5. There is some positions where you can castle, and it's so amusing because you're pinning the knight, so the knight can't move away. There's no discover check. Apparently that's a little bit much here. But so what the engine wants to do is to go rook f8, again pinning the knight. So super, super sharp, but basically speaking, the king doesn't really want to take that bishop, so you end up playing king f1. The queen then moves out of the fork, the knight picks up the rook. The advice is then for black to play d5, white takes, the knight comes on to d4, so the black pieces are kind of flooding into the white position. d6, I mean, it's not obvious that white should play this, but essentially what white's doing is regaining control over the f7 square to try and rescue that knight. We take with the queen, and then after queen e7, I seem to remember you end up with a draw by repetition. Look, bishop attacks the queen. There's a queen check there. Can the bishop come back? Looks like the knight needs to come back. The knight comes back. And then, you know, white picks up the bishop. But, I mean, the engine says this is a draw. Queen h4 check. I mean, black certainly has a lot of pieces around the white king. The engine says this is a draw. It's a beautiful position. Of course, over the board, it's an absolute nightmare. Well, depends what you enjoy. It's certainly very complicated and tactical. But broadly speaking, and I played a correspondence tournament around this opening line. Broadly speaking, if white actually takes the fork, practice and the engines suggest that this can be drawn by black. But I think white taking with the bishop, still very complicated, but the engines are saying that that white's a bit better, and basically white's got a pawn. Black does have a lot of attacking chances, but the engine says it's not quite enough, and white can hold the extra pawn and come out with a better game. So in this video, I'm not recommending bishop c5 unless, you know, you really like an interesting and complex game. And but I think in terms of pure objective evaluation, I think it's fair to say it's dubious, although it is playable. It is playable, and lots of people win with it lots of times, particularly on short time controls. So, but here's the funny thing. Here's what's interesting about this position. The original move, knight f6, it is a gambit, so it offers a pawn. You either end up losing the d pawn, or in some lines you lose the f pawn. But white can play in different ways as well. White can play pawn d4. Again, this is a very respectable, playable line. I mean, it's objectively not quite as good as the others, so the engines wouldn't favour it. But I've lost in these sort of positions. In fact, I struggle with these sort of positions. Future opponents note, I struggle. So what happens is you take the pawn and then they go e5. And I think the recommended approach was always to play d5 here, I think, isn't it? But the engine wants to play knight e4. What's that all about? I thought you always played d5. Isn't this is the famous Max Langer attack, isn't it? Yeah, so the most common move is d5. That's what people always used to play. The engine wants to play knight e4. Okay, let's ignore the engine today. d5, and then the bishop comes here. Then you get knight e4. Maybe the engine was just transposing, actually, just changing the order of moves. Bishop d4, and you get these sort of lines, which I think can also arise from the Scotch gambits. So basically in these lines, white has some nice attacking chances, but objectively black is equal, and these are less common. They're pretty uncommon at the elite levels. So the move d4 is a useful move at club level. It sort of gives white some nice, sensible attacking chances based on sort of sound principles. but objectively, it's probably equal. I think there are some wild versions as well here, aren't there? There's a wild version where white castles, and this is beautiful. Black takes here, white pins the knight, then you play d5 to try and hang on to the knight. Then white can just take it off. You take with the queen, so now white's given up a piece, but white has this beautiful move, knight c3, which is fantastic. So the pawn is pinned, you can't take the knight. The knight is forking the queen and the other knight, which is pinned. So the engine wants to go queen d7. I always used to play queen h5 here. Let's play queen h5. Queen h5. Then white gets the piece back. Then you can play bishop e6 or bishop e7 to stop a disaster happening. Bishop e6, bishop g5. I always used to play bishop e7. Turns out bishop d6 is better, is it? What happens after bishop e7? It's not so good. Okay, we're not going to do bishop. See, every day's a school day. We're going to do bishop d6, and then when white takes that, I mean, the game goes on, but if we just do a very quick count, I mean, black's a pawn up, and it's not a crisis. The engine says it's equal. Certainly, white has a nicer pawn structure. I mean, black's pawn structure isn't great. After bishop f4, white's certainly moving towards winning that pawn back. You know, I mean, black can queen d5, so it's not immediate. c3, you know, it's pretty equal game. But the point is really here that after pawn d4 here, there are sort of some interesting, after pawn d4 on move 4 by white, there are some interesting and tactical concepts where white has a decent attacking initiative. I mean, they're not as tactical as the Trexler. They're not like crazy tactical, but they're, you know, interestingly tactical. But the really interesting thing is, of course, white has another option here, which is what Stockfish wants to do at depth 64 and is absolutely played at the elite level, which is pawn d3. It's actually the most common move here. Now, pawn d3 leads to the famous Giaco Pianissimo, or the slow Italian, which is a very different kind of game. And it's a fascinating kind of game, but it's in many ways closer to the Spanish. And actually, it's the most commonly played move, and it allows a game of very different characters. So in a sense, white's not accepting the gambit. So if I were to be critical of this knight move, on move 3 by black, the problem with the move is not really that it allows the fork on f7, although initially that does look terrifying. The problem with it is it allows white to choose what kind of game white plays. It allows white to choose between the kind of knight g5 lines, which are very concrete, very forcing. It's good, you know, you probably need to memorize a fair bit. Or the pawn d4 lines, which are kind of logical and attacking, and white gets a fair bit of initiative. And black has to know what he's doing not to get overrun. Or the pawn d3 lines, which are solid, manoeuvring, slow games. And given that you give white the choice, that's a reason I would be a bit worried about that, because it allows white to play the kind of game that white wants to. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. I've enjoyed making it. I hope you're all enjoying your chess, and hopefully see you soon.